All right, welcome back to Served. JW is here, and special guest today, which is going to be very interesting, Karen Moorhouse, who is the CEO of the ITIA. And I got to think she's been busy since she took that job a couple of years ago. It seems like it's been a top of mind for all of us with the Sinner case, Swiatek of things, and just general confusion around who does what in tennis. It's like any other issue, except it has bigger consequences. So first of all, Karen, welcome. Thank you for giving us the time today. And for our listeners, because there is so much noise around anything to do with drug testing, positive tests, negative tests, suspensions, just simply, what do you all do?
Hi. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be on the show. So the International Tennis Integrity Agency, we run the anti-doping and anti-corruption programs for our tennis funders. Our tennis funders are the ITF, the WTA, ATP, and the 4 Grand Slams. They collectively recognize the importance of this work, the importance of integrity to protect their event and to protect the players who play in them. And therefore, this is one area where they worked on together and established the International Tennis Integrity Agency to run those programs.
Great, thank you. And just, we'll get into more of this, but just as an aside, so all of the protocols that everyone is mad at, if I'm correct, are voted on by the members that you represent, that you just named, the ITF, ATP, WTA, and the Slam. So level set, it's like the ITA is representing the wishes of these governing bodies. Obviously, the biggest story of last year, and it looks like it's going to bleed into this year, is Jannik Sinner and his 2 positive tests for clostebol last year. I think we, as consumers of this sport and information about the sport, tend to be pretty lazy in our opinions. So I think my goal, selfishly, is to kind of very clearly walk us through timelines, decisions made, reasonings, without being interrupted, without, all of the carnival barkers and everyone else that kind of has an opinion, without being, fully informed. I would love to give you the stage just to walk us through, okay, Sinner, you find out that someone tests positive. What happens from there?
Sure. So just to go back to the previous comment. So yeah, the anti-doping rules and the anti-corruption rules are set by the tennis members. For anti-doping, we are a WADA compliant sport, so the rules have to be compliant with the WADA code. So that means there is only a little bit of discretion that sits with tennis, and we'll come on to some of that, no doubt, when we get into the Sinner case itself. But I just thought that might be useful background for you and some of the listeners. So in the case of Sinner, he had 2 positive tests for clostebol. One of those was during the Indian Wells tournament, and one of them was just after that tournament. What happens is you have a drug test. The urine or the blood sample then gets sent off to WADA accredited laboratories. They are the ones who confirm whether a test is positive or in most cases negative. We're then notified of that result. There's then a review board who check all the documentation, check everything's been done correctly. And then once the review board has confirmed that is the case, we notify the player of a positive test.
So
at that point,
sorry, just real quick, just for people listening. So, and tell me if this is still the case. When you do a drug test, for lack of a better way to put it, you do your urine sample, you hand it over, and I'm not a name that's being sent. I'm a number that's being sent.
That's exactly
correct.
Right.
So it's not as if we can look at it. It's not as if the person who's analyzing the test is going, this is Jannik Sinner's urine, or it's some version of 9 numbers, 13 numbers, and a couple of letters. I think that's important context also.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So at that point, Sinner came back very quickly with the explanation around the positive test. And his explanation was that his masseuse had been using a cream, tropodermin, that contains clostebol, had been using that to treat a cut on his own finger, and that in the course of massaging the player, some of that substance had transferred into the player's body. As we do with all cases, when people put forward an explanation, we test out the science with the experts. So in this case, we went to 2 WADA accredited laboratories. each of which confirmed that his explanation was credible. Because of the nature of the substances he tested positive for, he was automatically provisionally suspended. That's the case for all what they call non-specified substances. However, the player urgently issued a application to lift that provisional suspension. Again, that's set out in the rules, the ability to do that. And that application is considered by an independent tribunal chairman. And that independent chair lifted the application on the basis that Jannik Sinner established that he was likely to establish that he had no fault for the positive test. So at that point, he's no longer provisionally suspended and he's free to play. And under our rules, we don't make any announcement. We're required to keep that confidential. What followed then was a thorough investigation by the ITIA team. We have in-house investigators. That involved interviewing the player and also a number of his team, on some cases on multiple occasions. And that was really to test out his explanation, to make sure that that stood up to scrutiny. And ultimately, at the end of that investigation, we were satisfied that his explanation was correct. So then we had a decision to make in terms of what we did next. Whilst the player had established source, we then needed to determine sanction. And in this case, we referred it through to an independent tribunal to consider what the right sanction was, taking into account his level of fault. And that independent tribunal reached a decision that the player had no fault or negligence. In effect, he exercised utmost caution. And as a result of that, that meant there was no suspension imposed. Just one point to flag was that his results from Indian Wells were disqualified. That's automatic under the rules. If you test positive during an event, irrespective of your level of fault, those results are disqualified because in effect, you've had a banned substance in your body whilst you're competing at that event. As you all know, WADA have now appealed that decision to the Court of Arbitration and Sport, and that appeal will be heard middle of April.
Yeah, can I jump in? I mean, I think one of the initial concerns and complaints, and you've done a nice job, and I appreciate that, sort of dispelling it, was that there was preferential treatment. That clearly wasn't the case. Oh, we have a star, we need to protect him. It does seem, though, that there are two very different paths. One for a player that tests positive and furnishes a quick explanation. Hey, my trainer used a banned substance on a cut and gave me an ungloved massage. Versus the player who tests positive and says, I have no earthly idea. It could have been something I ate. It could have been melatonin. I have no idea. Are you comfortable with that? I mean, it seems to me that a player who a player who cheats would be more likely to have an explanation than the player who says, I'm gobsmacked. I have no idea how I'm testing positive. It seems like you have these two tracks, and it seems as though the player who is doping ends up on the preferential track. Would you agree with that?
So I think you're right in the sense of every case turns on its facts and on the science. And in anti-doping cases, the burden of proof that you have in normal cases, where it's the party presenting the case who you have to establish that someone's done something, once there's a positive test, that burden of proof switches round in anti-doping cases. So once you've got a positive test, the burden then switches to the player to demonstrate the source of that prohibited substance. And therefore, how quickly you're able to identify that source very much turns on the facts. So in the case of Sinner, because of the circumstances, because of the involvement of the player entourage, he was very easily able to pinpoint the source of that contamination. You get that sometimes with contaminated supplement cases as well, where people very quickly get to the source. You have other cases where on the facts, it's much more complicated to establish the source. That isn't a rule that's applied differently to different players. It's the same. Everything turns on the facts of the case. And I understand and have sympathy for some players that can be quite challenging in terms of finding the source of a positive test. But you then step back and go the alternative of the burden being on a regulatory body to not just find that there was a positive test, but also to establish why a player had a positive test would totally defeat the fight against doping. I don't necessarily agree that someone who is intentionally doping will be able to give that explanation more easily, because ultimately we're going to test out their explanation. So the scientists are going to scrutinize whether what they're saying is credible, whether the explanation they're giving not only explains the fact they've got that prohibited substance in their body, but it explains the levels they've got in that body. And equally, we're going to follow it with a really thorough investigation to any witnesses or equivalent that are relevant. So, you're going to absolutely examine the explanation that anyone puts forward and really scrutinize that.
Karen, can you explain the timeline of that the players have? So let's say I test positive, I don't know why. How much time do I have to provide an explanation to the ITIA from that moment forward?
I think there's probably two key timelines that are relevant here. Ultimately, you have got, if not as long as you need, you've got a considerable amount of time. Whilst we will try and run investigations as efficiently as we can, we always try and balance that with giving the player every opportunity they have to try and identify source. And that feeds into the length of time some cases take, because we're making sure that players have had that chance to go out and do all the research they need to try and establish source. There's then a second timeline, which has been relevant in these cases around when we announce positive tests for non-specified substances. And under tennis's rules, we don't announce positive tests and provisional suspensions for at least 10 days. So we'll notify a player that they have been provisionally suspended, but they then have 10 days in which to challenge that. And if their challenge is successful, we then do not announce that provisional suspension. So there's probably two different timelines that are relevant.
Right, which is what happened with Sinner, we should probably add. Can I do want to go back to the timeline, but can I ask you sort of a big picture question, and then we can revisit. In the last few years, we've had 4 current or former number 1 players test positive. There have been 5 major singles champions in the last few years that have tested positive. This is a huge uptick. And so I think there are a couple of conclusions you could draw. One of them is that tennis is so dirty that even the top players are doping despite the risks of their reputation. You could also say, well, wait a second, maybe tennis has always been dirty and the testing has caught up. And then the third explanation is that the testing has gotten so good and so precise that minuscule amounts are triggering positive tests. And if you fall into that third category, is there anything that the ITIA can do that you can do to change these thresholds so a grain of sand in a swimming pool worth of melatonin for jet lag is not causing a scandal? Sinner also has made repeated reference to the small amount. Is there anything you can do to change these thresholds if you believe that is what is triggering this glut of positive tests?
Yeah, so a couple of really interesting points in that. I think it's worth just highlighting that the high-profile cases we've had over the last couple of years have all involved inadvertent doping. So, and I think that's sometimes lost in some of the commentary around this in terms of, does tennis have a problem with doping? Well, actually, these are all inadvertent positive tests. So what that probably highlights is a need for players to really understand the rules and to really buy into the education and to make sure that they're taking all the steps they can to understand the rules and absolutely mitigate the risks in terms of any inadvertent positives. In relation to the question around the levels and the challenge around the fact that laboratories are so good that they're really good at their job, they pick up when there are prohibited substances in players' bodies. Ultimately, tennis is part of WADA, so we follow the WADA code. So any decision in relation to detection levels is a decision for WADA, and then we will follow whatever the prohibited list says, and the laboratories will follow whatever the prohibited list says. And it is complex because it's that fine line between striking the right balance between not picking up very, very low levels of contamination versus ensuring that you're not creating a loophole and a gateway for really sophisticated doping when you're talking about microdosing and those really small levels, and also picking up at the end of excretion curves. So that's probably for smarter people than me and the scientists to make sure that they're getting that balance right. And then we will follow whatever the WADA experts say and what is built into the prohibited list.
Karen, can you tell us why WADA is the body of choice to partner with?
Sure. So I suppose a really simple answer is that tennis is an Olympic sport, and all Olympic sports are required to follow WADA. I'm conscious that you will all say, but what about basketball? They managed to not, or should I say the professional league in the US, the NBA, are not part of WADA. And I think that's a crucial distinction. The players who participate in the Olympics for playing basketball for the duration of the Olympics and before that are bound by the WADA rules. Tennis is complicated. Ultimately, the ITF is a member of the IOC, and so all members of the IOC have to run their events in accordance with WADA. There's also certain countries around the world where any events that take part in those countries, such as France, have to be run in accordance with WADA compliant rules. So because tennis is a global sport, not restricted to one country, it would be really complicated not to have WADA compliant rules. You'd have a patchwork where you'd have players competing one week being bound by the WADA rules and then potentially another week not bound by the WADA rules, which would be a crazy situation. There's lots of benefits as being part of WADA as well. They invest significant amounts in relation to the research, development, science side of things. Ultimately that benefits our programs as well.
So it's weird because you say global, like tennis is a global sport, which makes it challenging with picking and choosing with WADA, but like basketball is a global sport. It's just the biggest league is played predominantly in the US. Are you telling me that if we had all the same participants in tennis, but it was basically, geography wise, it was only in America, that you could sidestep this situation like the NBA seems to?
I think professional leagues can make decisions for what a professional league wants to do. If you're part of the international sports network, so you're an international federation or a national federation, you are part of the WADA framework and fabric.
All right, so how do you become a league becomes the question, and that's maybe a slippery slope, but we won't get into that right now. One of the kind of things, and I kind of have an opinion, and I don't know, I hope that it's informed. So a lot of the conversation around Sinner and preferential treatment is that there have been players who are lower ranked whose cases aren't the same as far as, it's we kind of get into this thing where it's like positive test, negative test. Those are the only two cases that exist, right? Like, and we litigate those as all the same, different drugs, different timing, different everything else. But a lot of the initial pushback was basically like, Tara Moore is a good example of a name of a player who wasn't as successful as Jannik Sinner, whose case has dragged on and on and on, seemingly. One, is that the case? And two, is it as simple as every other part of life where if you simply have the resources to organize, you're going to get a quicker result? That's not a tennis problem. That's a world problem, correct?
Yeah. So I think, again, I come back to every case is different and cases can be really complex and all of them turn on their individual facts. In the case of Sinner, he was really easily able to identify source. And of course he was, we investigated promptly and it could therefore be managed really efficiently. In the case of Moore, her case is much more complicated. Clearly, her argument was around meat contamination. But there is complications to that in terms of actually having the evidence to identify that. Equally, whilst we want to deal with cases as efficiently as we can, as I mentioned earlier, we will always make sure we're giving the players every opportunity to find the evidence they need and to put forward their mitigation. And that plays into the length of time that each different case takes. And that played into the length of time it took to get Tara's case to the first instance hearing, where she was found to have no fault or negligence. Her case is also going through to the CAS tribunal on appeal, which will be heard in the coming months.
And one of the other things, and the name is escaping me, but it was another Italian player who tested positive for clostebol. And so my argument was kind of, and I don't know anything about suspension. I don't know. I just simply believe that it would be idiotic for Sinner to go down this path for minimal enhancement, right? Like, if you're not getting anything out of it, why would you put your career at risk? But people are saying, oh, well, the lower ranked players don't get treated well. There was an example of an Italian player with clostebol months before Sinner that kind of ended in the same spot. Is that kind of generally correct?
Yeah, there was a case, Bortolotti. It was the start of last year. Yeah, same substance. So clostebol, an Italian player, and he was found to have no fault or negligence. And actually his case was much quicker than Sinner's because the facts, again, given the circumstances, he was very quickly able to identify the source. Because the source was someone who was outside his entourage, there's a whole series of precedent cases of indirect contamination from people outside your entourage that have led to no fault or negligence findings. So in his case, we were able to come to a decision within the ITIA. We reached a case resolution agreement, in effect an agreed sanction. It didn't go through to tribunal, and his case was dealt with in significantly less time than Sinner. So it's a good example of one where it demonstrates that how we manage these things are very much driven by the facts. They're not driven by ranking.
How do you parse that further? Where if a player is determined to have no intent, no negligence, it seems awfully harsh to sanction them, and yet that creates a heck of a loophole. If someone else as part of the team can engage in doping as long as it's kept from the athlete, that would seem to create an awful big precedent and loophole. How do you navigate that?
So I think how it works is the starting point for any positive test is 4 years. If a player can show that they had no intention to dope, then it reduces down to 2 years. If the player can demonstrate they had no fault or negligence, they get down to no sanction. And then there's a range, again, slightly depending on circumstances, from no sanction up to 2 years where there is no significant fault or negligence. But a player cannot simply say, I didn't know, I relied on my entourage to decide what supplements I was taking, and therefore I don't have any fault. You wouldn't get no fault or negligence for relying on a member of your entourage and then taking something that they recommended. You would end up in the range there.
Can I follow with that range? I mean, this is under appeal. And if you read the code, it makes pretty clear if there's a positive result, it's a year is the minimum. There are also rules about proportionality. And if you have determined the player has no negligence, it seems awfully disproportionate to sanction them for essentially 10% of their career. As you understand it, does this appeals tribunal have the ability to create their own sanction? 60 days is something that's been bandied about. Are they bound by 1 year, or do you think it's possible that they will have some sort of license and leverage to create their own sentence?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a unique point in some ways on the Sinner case. So when you have contamination cases, so contaminated supplements, the range can go right from reprimand up to 2 years. But because the Sinner case doesn't involve a contaminated supplement, the trophobirmin was exactly what it said it was. It's what it says on the tin. You don't get the benefit of, under the rules of the sanction, going right down to a reprimand. Under the rules, the least you can get is 1 year, so half the otherwise applicable sanction. So strictly as you read the rules, you would say the range is 1 year to 2 years. Ultimately, that decision on sanction sits with the CAS tribunal. They're the ones who are empowered to make the decision. So that's something that they will have to navigate when they look at the facts and decide how they interpret the rules and how they apply them. Whether they can agree with the original tribunal and determine that this is no fault or negligence, or if they don't agree with that original tribunal.
So another thing that's hard to digest in a headline, right, is we opened with saying WADA is our chosen partner, correct? We make a ruling. WADA then kind of re-enters the conversation and doesn't want to relitigate facts, just wants to relitigate the way that the rules were applied. And so it's a strange thing when you kind of, it's a partnership, but also do you feel like you're looking over your shoulder? Like WADA re-enters the conversation. What are their potential outcomes in April, and why do they feel the need to re-enter this conversation?
Yeah, so under the rules, there's a number of different parties who have the right to appeal decisions from the sports res appointed independent tribunal. So that can be the player, as it was in the case of Simona Halep. It can be the ITIA, as is the case in Moore. It can be the Anti-Doping Association from the country of the player, so the NADO, or it can be WADA. And that's just one of the inbuilt checks and balances that there is within the framework to protect all the different parties. And from WADA's perspective, they have that global oversight across all sports and all countries to know that, try and ensure that they keep that consistency across the whole anti-doping framework. In terms of, I think your next, was it about outcomes and what the potential outcomes were?
Yeah, like what are the potential outcomes that they're weighing right now?
Absolutely. So the first outcome is that they agree with the independent tribunal. The independent tribunal were comfortable that the player couldn't have done anything more, and that the CAS tribunal agree with that and decide that the player had no fault or negligence, and therefore there is no suspension. Indian Wells results, disqualification aside. The WADA's appeal, as I understand it, is that they're seeking an outcome of no significant fault or negligence. And as you read the rules, as Jon said, the range of potential outcomes for a no significant fault or negligence decision is 12 to 24 months. Ultimately, it's that CAS tribunal, though, who have to reach a decision that they think is appropriate based on the facts and application of the rules.
Whose rules exactly? Who's making these rules? Is this the group that oversees you, or who's making those rules?
So it's the tennis anti-doping rules, but a large amount of those are in effect the WADA code. So it's the same rules that are in place across all sports. So the same anti-doping rule violations and the same sanctions.
So is this? It's strange for us when we're kind of learning as we go, and I'm embarrassed because I should probably know more of the process. I just figured if I wasn't doing anything, I'd be fine, and maybe that was ignorant of me during my playing career. But we thought he was good. It's like no fault, no negligence. He's fine. Huge sigh of relief. Goes and wins the U.S. Open. Goes and wins the Australian Open. WADA re-enters the conversation. All of a sudden, we got to redo this in April. Is this the final thing, or if Sinner gets suspended, are there any other routes for him to appeal?
It is a final appeal tribunal. I guess for the sake of absolute completeness, in theory, someone could go off to the Swiss Federal Court. I think pretty much unheard of in the case of anti-doping cases. But I say that just to make sure that I'm giving you the absolutely legally correct answer. But this is a final appeal tribunal, and therefore this should be the final decision.
I've got a sort of a philosophical question and a specific question. I mean, I guess when you look at your job and the role of integrity agency of tennis, what is more concerning? An athlete who dopes and seeks an unfair advantage skating and skirting the system, or an athlete with no intent getting caught in the gears of this? I mean, it seems like we sort of are balancing interests here. What is the greater concern to you? It's essentially a false positive, an athlete who tests positive and there isn't intent, or there isn't, they're not seeking an advantage, or an athlete who tests positive and somehow eludes detection? Because I think that's sort of a fundamental question when we're thinking about punishment and penalties and how to even start assessing doping in tennis.
Yeah, so a really important part of our work is education. And the reason that's so important is we want to make sure that we're helping and supporting players to make sure they're doing everything they can to mitigate risk. Partly because we want to protect those players. We want to make sure that people don't end up in that situation when they're on the end of a charge for something that they had no intention of doing. But partly because we really want to make sure that we're reserving our resources around investigations and case management and what have you for those cases where there is genuine doping. That's in the interest of the sport. So, my job is to try to make sure that we are getting to players, and actually these high-profile cases, have actually meant we've had a lot of engagement across the sport and from players around our work, perhaps in a way that we haven't had previously. And I'm hoping that one of the real benefits in that is that it opens the door to conversations, and it opens those doors to players really challenge themselves on what they're doing, to try to ensure that they don't end up accidentally breaching the rules. And in turn, that means that I can really use our resources on that intelligence side to ensure that we're really scrutinizing and making sure that there isn't people out there within tennis who are intentionally breaching the rules, and that if they are, we find them and we take action.
This is less about the balls and strikes. It's more, I'm interested in your response, because if I'm you and I go through all of this science, all of this data, go through the facts, litigate these things to where we're putting it in front of the right people for the best potential chance at a fair outcome, you put in all this work and you release it, and some dummy reads the headlines and goes, well, it's fucked. This is bullshit. This is all that. Like, what's the most frustrating part about your job where you can do all this work, it gets released, some people might read it, and then, some Yahoo with a megaphone can shout stuff that just isn't based in fact. Is that the most frustrating part of your job, or is it something that's way smarter than what I came up with?
No, I think that's a pretty good summary in some ways. I mean, you alluded earlier in terms of the resources thing to the fact that we live in the real world, and we live in a world now where social media is so dominant, and you've got to summarize everything in 260 characters and what have you, and therefore, one of the really important parts of our work, working closely with my comms team and everyone else is trying to make sure that we find opportunities to engage with people in the sport, to make sure that they have the opportunity to ask all the questions that you're asking today, so that they can really understand cases and they can really understand what we do, rather than simply seeing a headline that's intended to draw clicks and what have you, and getting their information from that. We want people to come to us and get their information from us.
To kind of follow up on that point, when you look at the Tara Moore case, she had however long and she lost ranking points. How often are you guys looking at the process, analyzing the process, and then making recommendations to yourselves and to the bodies that you kind of report to about, could you freeze a player's rankings while you're going through it in appeals like this? Because now somebody like Tara Moore, who doesn't have the ability that other people do, she has to fight her way back to a place that took her so long to get to. How often are you guys looking at those processes and then being retroactive and making recommendations on improving the process?
Totally. I mean, I think across all of our processes, the simple answer is all the time. We'll always, look at things that have happened and see whether there's things that we should change. I think that's what any good organization, any good integrity organization should be doing. Saying that, I think I've got an excellent team and I'm really confident and comfortable in the work that we do. On the specific point you raise, that does sit outside our remit. The issue of ranking points sits with the tours, but I know it's something that they have looked at, the WTA have looked at on the back of cases, and no doubt the ATP too, because clearly there is that knock on. And where you have a player who is found to have no fault or negligence, have absolute sympathy in that, in the position that they shouldn't indirectly suffer that detriment.
So let's keep going with that to Sinner. Having just said that, what does a fair outcome look like to you?
I think our role is to invest, to deal with, to run the testing program, to deal with the positive test, to investigate, to get all the scientific information. In this case, to present it to the tribunal. Ultimately, that decision in terms of what the right outcome is now sits with that CAS tribunal. That's their job.
But it's not necessarily the investigation that's being appealed. It's the application of penalty to the rule book. So what would you like to see happen here? This is not it's not sort of this is not becoming a referendum on chain of custody and the investigation. It's simply application of penalty. So what would a just outcome look like in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, look, we didn't appeal, and we were comfortable with the decision from the first instance tribunal based on the presentation of the arguments, and you can all read that decision. It's on our website. Clearly, WADA will present their case, and the player will present his case to the CAS tribunal. And until we've heard those arguments, in a way, you're asking me to look into the future. And ultimately, I'd say that is a decision for that CAS tribunal, not for me.
As the public who digests these rulings, what else do we get wrong, or what else should we be asking to the people that are investigating, the people that are ruling? What do we miss most often that we haven't already talked about?
So I think the starting point is that the anti-doping rules and the processes that apply to cases are really complex. And therefore, to expect players or yourselves to be experts and to understand every single nuance in relation to how anti-doping cases are managed would be totally unrealistic. I think our job is to make sure that you have the confidence in the people who are applying those rules and who are running those processes, so that the starting point when you get a decision, you think, oh, I don't quite understand that, is not, oh gosh, there's clearly something gone wrong here. but to go, you know what, I'll pick up the phone to Karen, I'll contact Adrian in the comms team because I'm sure there'll be a good explanation. And that's our challenge. We want to make sure the players have trust in us to do the job, and also the confidence to know that if they've got any questions at all in relation to any of the cases, just pick up the phone and ask us a question. We'll be happy to answer it. You said it, Andy, actually. During your career, you weren't looking at this bit of the rule book because you were a clean player. You didn't need to. And that's the case for the vast majority of players. When players are thinking about anti-doping, we don't want them to be spending time reading the rules on, CAS procedure. We want them to be thinking about, what supplements are they taking and what steps are they taking to make sure they're mitigating their risks, thinking about, is there any medications they're taking? Do they need to apply for a therapeutic use exemption? What they're eating when they're in South America. They're the anti-doping subjects that players should be thinking about, not detailed legal procedure around CAS.
I was interested in something you said very early on, that this is about preserving and protecting integrity, and you mentioned match fixing. I'm wondering what you think is a bigger threat to tennis's integrity. Match fixing or doping, and are your resources allocated accordingly?
It's a really, really good question. I think, as with all sports, we're vulnerable to both. And as with all sports, we have to make sure that we're wise to those vulnerabilities and that we're taking steps. We're really fortunate in that our members really buy into that and have invested heavily in us to make sure that we've got the resources, and we can therefore be flexible in terms of where we need to weight our resources across the two areas. It's interesting that clearly our anti-doping work is what has been in the headlines over the last few months. That's natural when you've got cases involving number one players, but actually we had more cases last year involving corruption than we did doping. But they tend to be at the lower levels of the professional sport, and therefore they're not going to be what grabs the headlines. However, both are equally important in terms of making sure that the people can believe the product they're watching, and that people want to watch, sponsors want to invest, media want to show the sport. So I probably weight them both equally, and it's important that we just have the flexibility to adjust and respond to where the biggest risks are at any given time.
It would seem that with match fixing, though, that there has to be a pretty obvious paper trail at some point. Like, I understand a contaminated substance, and I often, and maybe it's mistaken, but I often, when these come out, I try to put myself in someone's shoes. The worst day of my life would have been had I gotten an email that said you tested positive for something and I didn't know. I can't imagine getting anything worse, and I also can't imagine accidentally fixing a match. So it's like, is it more cut and dry with match fixing than it is we've dealt with all the nuance and complexities of anti-doping? It seems like it would be way more straightforward. Is that a naive opinion?
I think you highlight a really key part of the education program, which is certainly the work we do around education. There is so much more nuance around the anti-doping side, because actually with the match fixing side, you're talking about people's values, and as you said, Andy, for most players it's just that, well, I would never do that. Whereas actually clean players are still impacted by the anti-doping program because they're still being tested and there's still risk for them. So that's really important on the education side. In terms of investigations, on the anti-doping side, you have positive tests, which is your bit that you can respond to. In anti-corruption, we have to work really hard with the betting industry, and we've built really good relationships with them, because what we need from them is the match alerts so that we know where to look. Then once we've got that match alert, we can go out and investigate. We can talk to the players, as appropriate and necessary. We can look for mobile device downloads to then build the case. The burden of proof in relation to corruption cases sits with us. So we have to go out, even once we've got that match alert, we've still got to go out and find the evidence to demonstrate that match, that particular point, has been fixed. So there's a lot of work that goes into those investigations to ensure that we have enough compelling evidence to demonstrate to a tribunal that particular match has been fixed.
And when you say match alert, is that some combination of outlier results and insane amount of money bet on a given match versus other comparable matches? Are those the kind of the obvious markers?
Yeah, I mean, the betting companies all have their own systems, but in essence, it's where something looks out of kilter in relation to the betting markets, either lots of money moving to a particular player or unexpected result. larger amounts than you would expect on that match. So there's lots of different things, incredibly smart systems by incredibly smart people to try to make sure they're picking up on things that are out of kilter so that we can then go and look into them.
Yeah, in match fixing, the penalties seem like they're more straightforward. You either did or you didn't, and therefore there's not this play between one body can say no negligence and the other one can say, you know what, it might be a year. It seems like it's a little bit more clear cut, maybe harder to find, but a little bit more clear cut once the investigation has taken place.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right in terms of whether there's a breach. Of course, then there's the mitigation and personal circumstances and the like. But yes, you've either fixed the match or you haven't.
No, I want to reiterate how much we appreciate this. More communication is always better than less. One thing that it's sort of a question about your job that no player has ever tested positive, no athlete in any sport that I know of, and said, yep, you know what, you got me, busted, what's my penalty? There is initially always denial and explanation and alibi. How do you stave off, I don't want to say being jaded, but sort of how do you keep skepticism at bay and not roll your eyes when every athlete that's ever, tested positive expresses shock and has an alibi and says why this can't possibly be true? How do you navigate that?
Again, a really interesting question. And look, part of our job is to be naturally a little bit skeptical because, we've got to do that so that all of you can just enjoy tennis and enjoy watching it, knowing that it's the ITIA's job to make sure that they're out there protecting the sport. Saying that, I've got a really good team of people who are good people. And who, something we talk about a lot is making sure, looking after people in the course of investigations, even people who've made really bad choices in relation to corruption. It's still really important that, and all of my investigators will make sure that they treat them in a sensitive way and an appropriate way and also look after their interests along the way.
Karen Moorhouse, CEO of the ITIA, we appreciate your time today. We appreciate your clarity. Hopefully this is a little bit more of an open space where you can expand upon a thought and not be judged in the first 5 seconds of whatever it is you may have said. Anytime that you think we ever get anything wrong, please come on the show and tell us why. We're always trying to get a little bit smarter about it. And thank you for your time today on Served.
Thank you. Take care.